So I was asked this question: do people have a trauma, a childhood trauma? Are they more likely to end up using? And the answer is this: there's no one size fits all. There are some people who who had a trauma as a child who end up and don't use. And there are some people that do end up and self-medicate. You know, I remember reading a story in Psychology Today on addictions, and there was a center spread. And on the left-hand side, there was a guy in America, he was on death row. And he was being interviewed, and the question was, what do you attribute to ending up on death row? And he said this: I grew up abused by my father. My twin was abused. My mother was beaten. We were beaten. My father was always committing petty crime. He was always in and out of prison. My father was using gear. How do you think I was going to grow up? I ended up growing up being aggressive, being violent, committing crime, and using. And then on the other side of the center spread was his twin. And his twin was this very famous lawyer. And he worked for the Innocent Project. And he found people who had unequivocal DNA, who'd been incarcerated for 20 or 30 years, who found out that actually they had never committed the crime. And he spent years getting these people out of incarceration. And he's being interviewed, and they said, what do you attribute to being this defender of the public, helping people? And he said, I grew up with an abusive, alcoholic father who was always beating me and my brother, who was always beating my mother, who was always committing petty crime, who was always using gear, who was always in and out of prison. How do you think I was going to grow up? And I think the answer is this: it's not what happens to you. And I'm not saying whatever happens to you doesn't affect you. Of course it does. Listen, if you know my story, of going through mental and physical, years and years of violence and abuse, you'll understand. I don't say this lightly, but some people do end up using that to self-medicate. But the problem is this: it's a bit like having a cut, and you have this deep wound, this deep cut that needs stitching. But what do? You put a plaster over it. And for that short period of time you're using, that evening, that day, it seems to do the trick. The problem is it's going to come off. Not only is it going to come off, but that wound is going to gape wider, be deeper. It's never going to get resolved. The only way to address it is to deal with the issue, not to self-medicate using gear.